The boarding gate was bustling with the usual chorus of rolling suitcases, muffled boarding announcements, and the occasional sigh of weary travelers. It was a typical Tuesday morning at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, one of the busiest in the United States. The crowd was diverse, business travelers in pressed suits, checking emails on their phones, families juggling strollers and stuffed animals, and solo wanderers with headphones tucked firmly over their ears. Among them was a woman who blended into the background with practiced ease. She was in her early 50s, slim and upright, with a posture that carried quiet discipline. Her travel outfit was unremarkable: dark jeans, a simple navy sweater, and well-worn sneakers. She wore no flashy jewelry, carried no luxury handbags, and her hair cut short in a practical style was peppered with gray. If one glanced at her, they might assume she was a teacher, perhaps, or a government worker traveling for a modest assignment. She held only one bag, a compact black carry-on with military efficiency in its packing. Unlike the others fumbling with overstuffed luggage, she moved smoothly through the jet bridge, her steps measured, her breathing steady. The flight crew barely noticed her as she presented her boarding pass. "Good morning, ma'am," the attendant at the aircraft door said automatically. The woman nodded politely, her eyes steady but soft. "Morning." Inside the aircraft, passengers wrestled with overhead bins and compared seat numbers. The air smelled faintly of recycled air mixed with coffee from the galley. She moved down the aisle without rush, her gaze scanning row numbers until she reached the right side of the cabin. Seat 13F window. She slid into the narrow space, placing her carry-on neatly beneath the seat ahead. She adjusted her sweater sleeves once, then folded her hands on her lap. To the casual observer, there was nothing remarkable about her choice of seat. Row 13 was just another row, and 13F just another window seat. But for her, the number carried a private resonance. She had never been superstitious pilots, couldn't afford to be. Numbers were coordinates, fuel ratios, or altitudes, nothing mystical. Yet when she saw 13F printed on her boarding pass, a flicker of memory had stirred. 13 had been her aircraft number once, years ago, during missions half the world never heard about. She had flown with the F-15 squadron, where her call sign became legend. And though she had left that life long ago, certain numbers still carried echoes of the sky. As passengers continued to file in, a young man in his 20s dropped heavily into the aisle seat beside her, headphones already clamped over his ears. He gave her a quick nod before diving into a playlist. Across the aisle, a mother tried calming her toddler while her husband searched for space in the overhead bins. A businessman nearby adjusted his tie for the third time. The woman sat quietly through it all. She had long ago learned the art of silence in crowded places. Her eyes turned toward the oval window, where the tarmac stretched under the morning sun. A line of aircraft taxied in the distance, their wings gleaming like polished blades. She watched them without outward reaction, but inside her, a pulse of familiarity stirred. Flying was never ordinary to her, even now as a civilian passenger. The rumble of engines, the scent of jet fuel, the precise choreography of takeoff, it was a world she had once commanded. She had spent thousands of hours in cockpits where every decision carried weight, where altitude and airspeed were matters of survival, not just comfort. Yet here she was, just another traveler with a boarding pass, waiting for coffee service at 35,000 feet. When the safety demonstration began, she listened out of habit, her sharp eyes noting the subtle differences between commercial procedures and what she had been trained for. The flight attendants smiled as they gestured toward exits, their voices polished and rehearsed. She respected them. Every profession in aviation demanded discipline, but her instincts never fully turned off. She mapped the exits automatically, counted seat rows, and calculated how quickly she could reach a door in an emergency. The engines roared to life, and the aircraft began to taxi. Passengers stowed phones, adjusted belts, and braced for the jolt of acceleration. The woman in 13F closed her eyes briefly, not in fear but in memory. She could almost hear the clipped chatter of her former wingmen over secure radio channels, feel the vibration of afterburners, smell the metallic tang of the oxygen mask. She breathed in, steady and measured, reminding herself, this was just another flight. As the plane thundered down the runway and lifted into the sky, she felt her heart respond the way it always had, an involuntary surge of exhilaration. Flight was freedom. Flight was power. Flight was the one place where the rest of the world fell away, and the horizon was infinite. For most passengers, the climb into the clouds was routine, a prelude to napping or scrolling through in-flight Wi-Fi. For her, it was something else entirely. It was a reminder of who she had been, and of the life she had chosen to leave behind. She reached for nothing, said nothing, and made no display of her inner world. Her call sign, once spoken with reverence in briefing rooms and on radio frequencies, remained locked away in silence. To everyone else in row 13, she was just another middle-aged woman traveling alone, unremarkable, invisible. And that was exactly how she preferred it, at least for now. What she did not know, sitting quietly in seat 13F, was that the sky had its own memory. The silence she carried would not remain hidden forever. The plane leveled out at 35,000 feet, its engines settling into the steady hum of cruise. The seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime, and the restless energy of passengers began to unfold. Flight attendants wheeled carts down the chi aisles, their practiced smiles and warm tones filling the cabin with a kind of normalcy every traveler knew well. Plastic cups clinked, soda cans hissed open, and the faint aroma of reheated meals drifted through the air. For most, it was just another cross-country flight. But not for her. The woman in seat 13F sat quietly against the window, her face illuminated by shifting clouds outside. The sky, to most passengers, was simply scenery, a beautiful backdrop for books, movies, or naps. To her, it was something else entirely. It was memory. Her eyes traced the contrails etched high above by other aircraft, thin white scars across the endless blue. Every pilot knew those trails. They were signatures, proof of others sharing the same air. Years ago she had made her own, carving lines across hostile skies where nothing was routine, where every maneuver carried weight. The man seated beside her, mid-30s, earbuds dangling, tapping on his phone, stole the occasional glance her way. She carried herself differently, he thought, not with arrogance, but with a quiet gravity. He couldn't place it. To him, she was just another passenger in row 13, but something about her stillness felt unusual. The flight attendants moved past, handing out drinks. She declined politely, her voice low but firm. Instead, she reached into her small leather bag and pulled out nothing more than a pen and a folded scrap of paper. She wrote quickly, methodically, as though the words mattered. When she finished, she tucked the note back inside without hesitation. No one noticed. The turbulence came suddenly, jolting the fuselage with a quick drop. Gasps erupted, and hands gripped armrests tightly. A baby cried somewhere in the rear cabin. The seatbelt sign flashed again, dinging overhead. But the woman in 13F didn't flinch. Her hand steadied on the window, her eyes fixed calmly on the horizon. For her, turbulence wasn't danger. It was rhythm. She had known skies where turbulence wasn't weather, but enemy fire. She had flown through storms where the difference between survival and loss came down to instinct measured in seconds. The contrast made her almost smile. The man beside her chuckled nervously, shaking his head. "Hate turbulence," he muttered, half to himself. "Feels like the plane's about to fall apart." She glanced at him, her tone even. "It won't. The air's just unsettled, that's all. Planes are stronger than most people think." He gave her a surprised look. "You sound like you know a thing or two." Her gaze drifted back to the window. "Maybe I do." He opened his mouth to ask more, but something in her expression stopped him. She wasn't dismissive, but there was a wall one built from years of knowing what to reveal and what to keep locked away. The turbulence faded and the cabin relaxed. Conversations resumed. A movie flickered on overhead screens, drawing attention. To most, the flight returned to normal. To her, it was never normal. Every sound, every shift of the engines, every angle of the wings, she noticed it all. It wasn't paranoia. It was training. Pilots didn't stop observing, even when they no longer flew. Her mind tracked altitude changes with subtle ear pressure, mapped the course by the sun's position, and calculated speed by instinct. She couldn't help it. Hours stretched on. Passengers dozed. Attendants poured coffee, and the world outside remained vast and endless. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the glass, as though reaching for the sky itself. Flying used to mean something different. It wasn't just transport. It was life. It was control, power, responsibility. At 35,000 feet in a commercial seat, she was just another passenger. But in her heart, she still belonged. To the cockpit, where metal responded to her touch and the sky answered to her will. The man beside her eventually spoke again, softer this time, almost as though he were afraid of breaking her concentration. "You ever wish you could fly this thing?" Her lips curved faintly, a shadow of a smile. "All the time." He laughed, shaking his head. "Me too, except I'd crash us in about 3 minutes." Her smile lingered for a moment before fading back into quiet contemplation. Somewhere in the cabin, laughter erupted from a group of college students swapping stories. A toddler's laughter mixed with it, innocent and unbothered. The ordinary rhythm of life at altitude pulsed around her, comforting yet foreign. She was part of it and apart from it at the same time. Outside, the sky darkened slightly as the sun began its slow tilt toward afternoon. Clouds gathered in towering formations, their tops blazing white in sunlight while their shadows stretched endlessly below. She leaned forward, studying them, almost expecting to roll into them the way she used to, slicing through turbulence with precision. But here, she was just a passenger in seat 13F, watching, remembering. When the captain's voice returned over the intercom, announcing they were on course and making good time, most passengers barely noticed. She listened intently, reading. Between the lines, recognizing the cadence of a pilot who loved his craft. And for the briefest moment, she envied him. The hours slipped by in quiet intervals of thought and memory, the kind that only long flights could summon. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines become the soundtrack of recollection. Faces appeared in her mind, fellow aviators, comrades, mentors, and ghosts. Some had saluted her, others had fallen beside her. All lived in the silence of her memory. The man beside her shifted in his seat, lowering his voice as though confiding. "Something. You ever get the feeling we're not just passengers? Like maybe we're part of something bigger, even when we don't know it?" Her eyes opened slowly. She looked at him, studying his question. For most, it was idle philosophy, something to pass the time at altitude. But for her, it struck deeper. "Yes," she said softly. "I know that feeling well." He waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. Instead, she turned back to the window, where the contrails of another aircraft stretched across the sky, fading into nothingness. And that was the truth. Passengers thought they were simply moving from point A to point B, but the sky had never been just a highway to her. It was history. It was theater. It was battlefield. It was home. To everyone else on the flight, today was routine. To her, every second was remembrance. And though no one around her knew it yet, the sky itself was about to remember her in return. The first hour of the flight passed uneventfully. The hum of engines became white noise in the background as passengers settled into their own rituals. Some slept with neck pillows snugly fastened, others tapped away on laptops, and a few flicked through movies on the seatback screens. The cabin crew moved briskly, serving drinks and snacks, their smiles professional but worn. The woman in seat 13F remained quiet, her gaze alternating between the clouds outside and the occasional glances at her watch. She was calm, composed, and unbothered. Flying was never tiring for her, though she preferred solitude in the air. Every sound, the subtle pitch change of the engines, the faint creak of the fuselage in turbulence, meant something to her trained ears. Others might hear noise. She heard data. Then, about an hour and 20 minutes into the flight, something unusual happened. It started with a whisper of shadow across the wing. The woman's eyes flicked outward instantly, instinctively sharp, like a hawk scanning the horizon. At first, there was nothing but blue sky and soft wisps of cirrus clouds. But then, faintly, in the distance, she saw a speck moving with uncanny speed. Passengers began to notice, too. A child a few rows ahead pressed his face against the window. "Mom, look, another plane!" he shouted, heads turned. People craned their necks toward the starboard side. And then it appeared fully, a sleek, cutting-edge F-22 Raptor sliding smoothly into formation alongside the commercial jet. Its gray fuselage gleamed, its angles sharp and predatory. A collective murmur rippled through the cabin. "What the hell is that?" a man muttered. "Is that the Air Force?" another whispered. "Are we in trouble?" The pilot of the F-22 kept steady, his aircraft matching the airliner's speed with flawless precision. He wasn't close enough to alarm the passengers, but near enough for everyone to see the raw power in the jet's presence. Moments later, another shadow joined, this time on the opposite wing. A second Raptor, equally poised, took position. The commercial jet was now bracketed by two of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. The cabin was alive with speculation. Phones came out, people pressed their faces against windows, and chatter grew louder. Flight attendants tried to reassure passengers, though their own eyes betrayed curiosity. Over the PA system, the airline captain's voice finally broke the tension. Calm, professional, but tinged with something heavier than routine. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. You may have noticed two military aircraft flying in formation with us. Please remain calm. This is a routine coordination exercise with the U.S. Air Force. There is no danger to the aircraft, and we will continue on course as planned." The announcement soothed some, but not all. Passengers exchanged skeptical looks. "Routine? With Raptors?" someone muttered. The woman in 13F hadn't moved much. Her eyes remained locked on the jet outside her window. Her expression was unreadable, neither fear nor excitement, but something deeper, recognition. Her breath slowed as memories resurfaced. She had flown in formations like this before, except she had been in the fighter, not the passenger plane. She knew the posture of escort, the subtle discipline in the way the Raptors angled their flight. They weren't here randomly. This wasn't a drill. Something had triggered their presence. And then came the moment that shifted everything. One of the flight attendants approached row 13, holding a small slip of paper in her hand. She leaned toward the woman at the window. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said softly. "The captain received a message through the cockpit. It was unusual." They asked if someone in seat 13F could confirm an identification code. The woman looked up, her eyes calm, steady, but piercing. "What kind of code?" she asked. The attendant read the note carefully. It said, "If passenger 13F wishes, please state call sign for verification." For a long moment, silence hung heavy. Passengers around them weren't paying attention. Most were glued to the windows, filming the Raptors with their phones. But for the woman, the note was not a curiosity. It was a summons. She inhaled deeply, a flicker of old instincts rising. She had buried her call sign years ago, left it in briefing rooms, radio channels, and cockpits half a world away. But now, tens of thousands of feet above the earth, the sky had called her back. She looked at the attendant and nodded once. "Tell the captain," she said quietly, her voice firm, steady. "Valkyrie." The attendant blinked, uncertain of what the word meant, but she repeated it carefully before retreating toward the cockpit. The woman turned back to the window. She didn't smile, didn't flinch. She simply waited. Moments later, the change was visible. The F-22 on her side banked slightly, then tightened its formation. Its movements sharpened, precise, almost ceremonial. The other Raptor mirrored the adjustment. It wasn't random, it was acknowledgement, recognition. In the cockpit of those Raptors, the call sign had landed like a thunderclap. Valkyrie. The name belonged to one of the most decorated female fighter pilots in U.S. Air Force history. A legend from classified operations over conflict zones, whispered about in squadrons and respected across generations. She had flown missions where survival odds were near impossible and had returned again and again, carrying not only her own life but the lives of others. The F-22 pilots instantly understood who sat in seat 13F, and for them, escorting this aircraft was no longer just protocol. It was an honor. The passengers didn't know the significance. They saw two military jets flying alongside and assumed it was government procedure, maybe some security measure near restricted airspace. But the Raptor's sudden precision, the crispness of their formation, spoke a different language, one only those in the Air Force would understand. The woman in 13F leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the Raptors. She could almost imagine the pilots inside, young men or women, faces she didn't know, but part of the same lineage she had once carried with pride. She knew what they were doing. They weren't just escorting. They were saluting. For the first time on the flight, her composure shifted. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, barely perceptible but real. It wasn't pride, it was acknowledgement. A silent nod to the warriors in the sky who had recognized one of their own. Around her, passengers were still murmuring, speculating, and filming. None of them understood. None of them could. But the Raptors did. And high above the earth, in the thin air where the sound of engines merged with the silence of the sky, the bond between warriors endured. The woman in 13F had thought she was traveling anonymously, her past hidden in the folds of civilian life. But the sky had memory, and today it remembered her. The cabin had grown restless. What began as curiosity was evolving into nervous chatter. Passengers shifted in their seats, phones angled against the windows, capturing shaky videos of the Raptors that seemed almost too close for comfort. A man, in a business suit, muttered into his phone about military maneuvers. A teenager, too, rose up, narrated for a live stream, whispering, "This is insane. Guy's fighter jets are literally right next to us." But amid the noise, seat 13F was still. The woman sat upright, her gaze fixed on the fighter outside her window, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She had given her word to the attendant. She had spoken her call sign. And now she waited for the answer. Inside the cockpit, the F-22 pilots were already reacting. "Control? Confirm?" one asked over secure radio. His voice was steady, but the edge of disbelief was clear. "Confirmed," came the reply from air traffic control. "Passenger in seat 13F has self-identified as Valkyrie." The word hung heavy in the airwaves. It was more than a name. It was history. The lead Raptor's pilot tightened his grip on the stick. He knew the stories. Every fighter pilot did. Valkyrie wasn't a myth. She was a legend. She had flown sorties in some of the most dangerous skies on Earth, missions that had never been written in press releases, but whispered in squadron bars late at night. There were tales of her threading an F-15 through impossible terrain, of her covering a crippled wingman under enemy fire, of her landing a bird riddled with holes yet still intact. To the young pilots of the fifth-generation Raptors, Valkyrie was a name from a different era, but a name that carried reverence. "Copy that," the second pilot said, his voice hushed but resolute. "Then we show her the respect she deserves." Back in the cabin, the airline captain had locked his door after receiving the message from air traffic control. He understood he was in the presence of something unusual, something classified. He couldn't explain it to passengers. All he could do was fly steady and let the military handle whatever was unfolding outside. The woman in 13F, however, didn't need explanations. She knew the drill. The Raptors weren't just flying in escort anymore. Their movement slight adjustments, precision angles, signaled a shift in posture. It wasn't for the passengers. It was for her. Then it happened. The lead Raptor dipped its wings slowly, a gesture crisp and deliberate. A wing dip in combat. Aviation was no trivial maneuver. It was salute, acknowledgement, and respect all rolled into one. A gesture reserved only for those who had earned it. Passengers gasped. Some thought it was turbulence. Others thought it was part of the exercise. But the woman knew. Her heart tightened, not in pride, but in a deep, almost painful recognition. This wasn't for the crowd. It was for Valkyrie. She had never expected to hear her call sign again. Not here, not now, not after years of silence. She had left the Air Force quietly, without ceremony, her record sealed in parts, her debriefs locked away in files ordinary people would never read. She had walked into civilian life without medals on her chest, without fanfare. That was the way it had to be. And yet here, in the anonymity of seat 13F, the sky itself had found her. She leaned slightly toward the window, the faintest of nods leaving her chin. To anyone else, it was imperceptible. To the Raptors, it was everything. The second fighter mirrored the first, its wing tipping in unison, completing the salute. For the woman, it was as if the past had reached out and touched her in the present, binding two generations of warriors across the thin line of atmosphere. Around her, passengers continued to speculate. Are they, like, escorting us into restricted airspace? Maybe there's a threat we don't know about. No way, dude. They're filming a movie or something. The flight attendants kept their smiles fixed, though unease had crept into their eyes. They glanced at the woman in 13F occasionally, sensing without understanding that somehow she was at the center of this strange dance. The woman kept her silence. Her call sign wasn't for them. It wasn't for the cabin crew, or the business travelers, or the curious teenagers live streaming. It was for the few in the sky who spoke the same unspoken language. Her mind drifted back, unbidden, to the day she had earned the name Valkyrie. It had been over a decade ago, in a hot zone where the stakes were life or death. She had flown. Cover for a squadron pinned down under hostile fire, refusing to break even when her bird had taken hits. She had turned the tide that day, keeping her wingmen alive when odds had screamed otherwise. The debrief later had been quiet, clinical, just numbers and reports. But among the pilots, a nickname had spread like wildfire: Valkyrie. The warrior, maiden who led souls through battle. She had carried it proudly, though never boastfully. Call signs weren't chosen, they were given, and hers had been a badge of honor. Now, years later, it had resurfaced in the thin air above a commercial flight. For the F-22 pilots, the gesture wasn't enough. They wanted her to know she was still one of them. The lead Raptor adjusted slightly, its nose rising, then dipped again before sliding back into formation. A message without words. We see you. We honor you. You're not forgotten. The woman exhaled slowly, the ghost of a smile tracing her lips. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel it, the bond of the sky, the fraternity that never truly let go. The passengers would land thinking they had witnessed a spectacle, maybe even an inconvenience. They would tell stories about the day their plane was flanked by Raptors. They would post videos online, sparking debates and conspiracy theories. But the truth of what had happened in that thin slice of sky would remain invisible to them. It was not about national security drills. It was not about a threat. It was about a call sign spoken aloud. A single word that had carried across the decades and drawn two Raptors to bow their wings in respect. The woman in seat 13F leaned back against her headrest, her eyes softening as the hum of the engines filled her ears once more. She closed them briefly, just long enough to imprint the moment in memory. She had thought she had left Valkyrie behind. She had been wrong. The sky never forgets. The cabin was alive with restless energy. The novelty of fighter jets flying alongside had worn into unease for some giddy fascination for others. Whispers crisscrossed the aisles like static, bouncing from row to row. Why would the Air Force be here? Is there a threat on board? Maybe the president's plane is nearby. Most of the passengers didn't know much about aviation beyond what they saw in movies. To them, the Raptors were symbols of raw power, their angular frames cutting through the sky like predators on the hunt. They looked dangerous because they were dangerous. The mere sight of them flanking a passenger jet was enough to stir fear and awe. But in seat 13F, the woman understood every detail. The Raptors weren't flying casually. Their posture, their discipline, the subtle spacing in formation, it all spoke of intent. This wasn't a drill, and it wasn't a random escort. It was deliberate, precise, respectful. They knew who she was. She had spoken her call sign. And they had answered. The salute they gave, wing dips, mirrored movements, was a gesture invisible to most, but unmistakable to her. These weren't just pilots flying a security detail. They were warriors paying tribute. The F-22s had no faces. From where she sat, no visible expressions through their tinted canopies, yet she could feel the recognition. She had once been in their place, looking out at the world from inside a fighter jet, scanning the skies with absolute focus. And now they were looking at her. The weight of it pressed against her chest. Not pride, not vanity, but something quieter, heavier. Gratitude. Memory. She thought of the years she had carried that call sign, the countless sorties flown in skies far less forgiving than these. She thought of the friends she had lost, fellow pilots whose names were etched in stone at memorials scattered across bases. She thought of the nights when the sky had felt endless and lonely, when the roar of engines was the only company in a hostile world. Valkyrie. That name had meant everything once. It wasn't hers by choice. No pilot chose their call sign. It had been given to her by her squadron after a mission where she had held formation, even as chaos erupted, refusing to abandon her wingmen when retreat might have been safer. The debriefers had written it clinically, demonstrated resilience under fire, but her fellow pilots had seen more. They had seen a leader who carried others through the storm. They had seen a Valkyrie. Now, years later, the name had been spoken aloud again. And these young raptors had answered as if it were still sacred. She leaned closer to the window, her eyes softening. The faintest of nods left her chin subtle, but unmistakable. A pilot's nod. A warrior's acknowledgement. The raptors responded. The lead fighter banked slightly, just enough to signal its awareness. It slid forward, nose tilting, before returning to position with surgical precision. The other mirrored the motion, a perfect reflection. The gesture sent a ripple through her. It wasn't theatrics. It wasn't showmanship for the passengers, snapping photos on their phones. This was their language unspoken, silent sky to sky. She could almost imagine the pilots inside, helmets reflecting sunlight, eyes sharp behind visors. They were young. Almost certainly this generation of Raptor drivers were in their 20s, maybe early 30s. To them, she was a name in history, a story told in squadron bars after training flights. They had never flown with her, never met her, but they knew our call sign. And that was enough. They knew. And they were telling her, with every precise angle of their flight, we remember. The passengers didn't understand. To them, it was just jets flying close, doing something official. They pressed their faces to the glass, filmed shaky. Videos speculated in hushed tones. None of them could read the choreography unfolding in the sky. But she could, and it was almost overwhelming. Her throat tightened as memories pressed closer. She remembered the first time she had flown into combat, heart pounding against her rib cage as her jet cut into hostile airspace. She remembered. Voice of her wingman crackling in her headset, the terse brevity codes, a deafening roar when missiles locked and released. She remembered the clarity of those moments, the world reduced to airspeed, altitude, threat. And she remembered the aftermath, the missions that went right, the missions that didn't, the lives saved, the lives lost. The Raptors outside were more than just planes. They were symbols of continuity. The sky was never truly empty. It carried forward the echoes of everyone who had flown before. And today, it carried her call sign forward. The business traveler beside her, finally pulling his headphones off, noticed her focus. Crazy, huh? He said, jerking his chin toward the window. Must be some kind of drill. Or maybe someone important's on board. She gave him a polite nod, but said nothing. Words wouldn't bridge the gap between his speculation and her truth. He saw jets. She saw a salute. The flight attendants kept circulating, trying to project calm. One of them caught her eye, hesitated, and gave a small, almost nervous smile, as if sensing she was part of the reason this was happening. The woman offered a faint smile in return, reassuring, steady. But inside, she was anything but casual. Inside, she was carrying the weight of recognition. Recognition that came not from medals or ceremonies, but from something pure. Acknowledgement from those still in the fight. She had thought she was forgotten. Pilots retired. New generations took over, and the sky moved on. That was the way of things. But the call sign had found its way across years, across aircraft, across silence. It was still alive. The Raptors held formation, sleek shadows slicing through the blue. Passengers filmed, whispered, and guessed. But the truth was invisible. To them, only she could see the deeper meaning. And as the minutes passed, as the commercial jet pressed on toward Washington, she felt a calm settle over her. Not the kind of calm that comes from ignorance, but the calm of recognition. The calm of knowing that the sky remembers its own. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like just another passenger in another row. She felt, in some small way, like Valkyrie again. Not in a cockpit, not under fire, but honored in silence, carried by the same bond that had always defined the life of a pilot. And as the Raptors held their silent vigil beside the airliner, the woman in 13F closed her eyes for just a moment. letting the hum of engines wash over her. It wasn't the roar of afterburners. It wasn't the clipped chatter of combs. But it was still flight, still the sky, still hers. And she knew, as surely as she knew her own heartbeat, that this moment, this recognition in the sky, would stay with her forever. At first, most passengers thought the Raptors were just a passing novelty. Something unusual, sure, but nothing more than a mid-flight story to tell at dinner tables later. The mood inside the cabin was a mix of chatter, laughter, and nervous speculation. But the longer the fighters stayed, the harder it was to dismiss. This wasn't a quick flyby. The F-22s weren't veering away into the distance. They were holding tight formation, shadowing the commercial airliner with unwavering precision. People began to sense there was more to this than routine. A mother near the front clutched her toddler closer, whispering questions to a flight attendant. The teenager live streaming earlier now spoke into his phone in an urgent whisper. "Okay, guys, they're still here. Like right outside my window. They haven't moved. This is not normal." A businessman halfway down the cabin snapped his laptop shut, his jaw tight. If this was just a drill, they'd be gone by now, he muttered to no one in particular. The nervous energy spread. Passengers shifted in their seats, craning their necks to catch a glimpse through whatever window they could. Some whispered worst-case scenarios, terrorist threat, hijacking, mechanical failure. Others speculated about politics. Maybe someone important is on board, and they're protecting us. The crew did their best to keep order, their smiles stretched thinner with every pass through the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen," one attendant said softly over the PA, "please remain seated and calm. Everything is under control." The words calmed no one, except the woman in seat 13F. She sat as she had from the start, straight-backed, steady, her gaze fixed on the Raptor outside her window. Unlike the others, her composure wasn't forced. She wasn't feigning calm. She was calm. She understood what was happening in a way no one else aboard could. The passenger saw intimidation. She saw honor. The young man seated in the aisle beside her, headphones now around his neck, noticed her stillness. "You don't look worried," he said, his voice low. She turned her head slightly, offering a polite, almost detached smile. "No reason to be." "Are you kidding? 2 fighter jets are flying next to us." He leaned in, his voice a whisper. "Do you know something we don't?" Her eyes met his. They were clear, steady, unreadable. "Maybe," she said softly, before turning back to the window. The young man blinked, confused. He opened his mouth to press further, but something in her demeanor, something unshakable, made him stop. He looked away, unsettled by how certain she seemed. The other passengers, meanwhile, couldn't look away from the spectacle outside. Phones clicked, videos rolled. From the outside, it might have looked like a social media frenzy, just civilians fascinated by military hardware. But underneath, tension grew. Every passenger was asking the same silent question. Why us? The answer sat quietly in seat 13F, unnoticed by most. The Raptors weren't there for the plane. They weren't there for the passengers. They were there for her. The woman knew it, and the Raptors knew it. The rest of the cabin, though, had no idea. To them, the tribute unfolding in the sky was invisible. Then came a subtle shift. The lead Raptor edged slightly closer, still careful, still safe. Its movements were precise, almost ceremonial. For a fleeting second, it tilted its wing again, another salute, sharper this time, as if reinforcing the message. Gasps filled the cabin. A mother pointed frantically out her window. A man grabbed his phone tighter. "They're signaling us." Someone whispered loudly. "What does it mean? Is it a warning?" Speculation surged like wildfire, burning through every row. The woman in 13F let the corner of her mouth lift just barely. She knew what it meant. The raptors weren't warning anyone. They were speaking to her. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, toward the jet. A subtle dip of her chin, the kind only another pilot would notice. The raptor responded in kind, banking slightly before returning to formation. To the rest of the passengers, it was random aerobatics. To her, it was conversation. The young man beside her leaned closer again, whispering, "What is going on? You act like you know them." Her gaze stayed outside. "In a way, I do." The weight of her words made him fall silent. He studied her face, the faint lines etched by years of discipline, the composure that seemed unshakable. For the first time, he realized she wasn't just another middle-aged woman on a flight. There was something more, something heavy, something hidden, and it unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. The cabin's tension grew thicker. A few passengers called flight attendants over, demanding answers. The crew repeated the captain's earlier reassurance, routine coordination with the Air Force, but the words rang hollow now. People could sense this was more than routine. And though fear simmered, so did awe. Even the most anxious couldn't deny the beauty of the raptors cutting through the sky, their movements flawless, their power undeniable. A child pressed his palms against the glass, whispering, cool, under his breath, wide-eyed with wonder. An older man muttered, "Never thought I'd see one up close." But the woman in 13F didn't see cool. She saw family. She saw continuity. She saw the unbroken line of pilots who carried the sky forward, generation after generation. She remembered her first wing dip in salute years ago, when she was fresh in the cockpit, and an older pilot had acknowledged her after a brutal training exercise. That gesture had meant everything then, a silent welcome into a brotherhood. Now, years later, she was on the other side. The younger generation was saluting her. Passengers took notice of the raptors. But what they failed to notice was the faint, fleeting smile on her face. The first time she had allowed herself to smile in years when thinking of her old life. The sky had not forgotten her. And though no announcement would ever be made, though no passenger would ever truly understand, the tribute was unmistakable. The raptors weren't saluting the plane. They weren't saluting the passengers. They were saluting the Valkyrie. And in seat 13F, she sat quietly, letting the moment unfold, letting the passengers notice only what they could see. What they couldn't see was the bond in the sky. The cabin had grown strangely quiet. The hum of the engines, the soft hiss of air vents, and the faint beeps of seatbelt signs were the only constants. Conversations had thinned out. Passengers still whispered, but their voices carried a different tone, now more awe than fear, more curiosity than panic. Outside, the raptors held their line, unwavering, sharp silhouettes against the endless blue. They weren't leaving. They weren't breaking formation. They weren't just flying. They were waiting. And she knew it. The woman in seat 13F sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To an outsider, she looked ordinary, almost detached. But inside, her pulse was steady with a rhythm only aviators carried, the kind that synchronized with the engines, with the subtle tilt of wings, with the eternal language of the sky. She could feel the raptor's presence like an old memory, brushing against her, not as machines, but as kin. The rest of the cabin wondered if the jets were there because of them. She knew better. They were there because of her. The young man beside her, still restless, finally leaned in again. His voice was cautious, unsure, like he was approaching something sacred. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but they're not here for us, are they?" Her eyes stayed on the jet outside. "No," she said simply. The admission made him exhale sharply, like he had suspected, but hadn't wanted it confirmed. Then, who? She turned to meet his gaze. For a long second, she didn't answer. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried a weight that stilled him. When she finally spoke, it was quiet, almost tender. They're here for someone they respect. He swallowed hard. He wanted to ask more, but something about the way she said it, calm, final, without arrogance, made him stop. He leaned back into his seat, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The cabin around them was alive with half-truths and wild theories. Maybe there's a security threat. No, this is definitely protection detail. They must be escorting someone important. Somebody on this flight is special, has to be. The irony was thick. They were all speculating, all searching for meaning, while the answer sat in plain sight at 13F. She wasn't wearing her past on her sleeve. No medals, no insignia, no jacket with patches. Just a plain civilian blouse and travel bag tucked neatly under the seat. To them, she was anonymous. To the Raptors, she was unforgettable. The lead fighter shifted position again, sliding a fraction closer, like a companion walking in step with an old friend. The second followed seamlessly. Their presence wasn't aggressive, it was reverent. She lifted her chin slightly, acknowledging them. And then came the gesture, the one that carried no translation for anyone but her. The lead Raptor tilted. Its wings, not in the quick salute of earlier, but in a deliberate, sustained motion. It was slow, precise, almost ceremonial. A gesture that said, "We see you. We remember. We honor you." Gasps filled the cabin again. Phones whipped up to capture it. A child clapped without knowing why. A man muttered, "What the hell does that mean?" She didn't answer aloud. She didn't need to. She raised her hand instead, pressing it lightly against the window. Not a wave, not a show. Just contact skin against glass, acknowledging the bond. The Raptors, of course, couldn't see that small gesture. But she knew, deep down, that somehow they would. Feel it. Her mind traveled backward. She remembered her last time in the cockpit, hands wrapped around controls that vibrated with power. She remembered her own call sign being spoken across radios with clarity and weight. She remembered the wing dips she once returned when she was the one flying, the one saluting others who had paved the way. And now, years later, it had come full circle. It wasn't sadness she felt. It wasn't regret. It was something quieter, something more enduring, belonging. The bond was silent, but it spoke louder than anything words could offer. The young man beside her noticed her hand against the glass. For the first time, he didn't ask. He just watched, sensing that he was witnessing something private, something he had no right to intrude upon. He realized then that whoever she was, whatever she had done, it carried weight far beyond what any of them could guess. The flight attendants, too, noticed. They whispered to each other in the galley, their eyes flicking toward 13F. They had seen passengers cry, panic, argue, beg, and joke on flights. But never had they seen someone sit so calmly in the face of something extraordinary. One attendant, a former Army brat herself, recognized the look on the woman's face, the kind of quiet strength only service left behind. She didn't say anything, but deep down, she suspected. The other passengers, though, remained in the dark. For them, it was spectacle, mystery, rumor. But for her, it was reunion. The minutes stretched on. The Raptors stayed. The escort wasn't duty anymore. It was tribute. Inside the cabin, unease melted into awe. Even those who had feared at first now gazed with admiration. The fighters weren't threats anymore. They were guardians. Symbols of strength, loyalty, and connection. The woman in 13F exhaled slowly, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. It wasn't joy, Not exactly. It was recognition of her place in the unbroken chain of pilots who had come before and after her. She closed her eyes for a moment, just long enough to hear echoes of voices in her memory. Radio chatter, call signs, the clipped commands of combat. She remembered the rhythm, the cadence, the music of it all. When she opened her eyes again, the Raptors were still there, silent, watchful, respectful. The bond between them needed no words, no announcements, no explanations. The passengers could speculate all they wanted. The truth was hers alone. And as the plane carried on toward Washington, she sat back in her seat, steady as ever. She wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just seat 13F. She was the Valkyrie. And the sky remembered. The descent began with a subtle shift. The aircraft tilted slightly downward, the engines adjusting pitch as the captain's voice came through the intercom, calm and routine. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into Washington. D.C. local time is 3:47 p.m. Weather is clear, temperature a comfortable 78 degrees. Please remain seated as we prepare for landing. It was the kind of announcement passengers had heard countless times before. Yet today, it carried a weight, like the words had to push past the silent presence of the two Raptors still pacing them in the sky. The woman in seat 13F kept her gaze fixed on the horizon. Below, the patchwork of America unfolded, forests giving way to rivers, rivers stretching toward roads and cities. The familiar landscape stirred something within her. Every pilot knew the sight of land from altitude. But for her, the view carried history, memory, and sacrifice. The F-22s adjusted their formation as the commercial jet descended. They weren't leaving yet. They would stay until the very end, until she was safely grounded. Passengers craned their necks at the windows, whispering excitedly, "They're still with us. Maybe they're escorting us all the way to the airport. Why? What's so important about this flight?" The theories multiplied, but the truth stayed seated at 13F, quiet and composed. The young man beside her couldn't resist one last attempt. His voice was softer now, stripped of curiosity and filled with respect. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but they do. And that means something." For the first time, she turned fully toward him. Her eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. "It means everything," she answered. He didn't press further. Somehow, that single line was enough. The captain came back on the intercom, his tone more deliberate this time. "Folks, you may notice we have some special company off the wings today. Nothing to be alarmed about. Just a routine military escort as we enter restricted airspace. Please remain seated." The explanation was half-truth at best, but it settled most nerves. Yet the woman knew better. She could hear the shift in the captain's voice, professional, but humbled, as though he too suspected the escort wasn't just protocol. The descent steepened. Washington's skyline began to emerge in the distance, the glint of the Potomac winding its way like a ribbon through the city. The Capitol dome and Washington Monument stood tall against the sky, proud symbols of the nation she had once served in silence. The Raptors slid slightly ahead, almost guiding the jet toward its path. Their wings caught the sunlight, flashing silver brilliance against the blue. To the untrained eye, they were just aircraft. But to her, they were living testaments, extensions of a tradition she had lived and breathed. And then, just as the jet aligned with its approach vector, it happened again. The lead Raptor dipped its wings sharper this time, a final salute. The second mirrored perfectly, as if choreographed. It was brief, powerful, and absolute. Passengers gasped, some clapped. A few cheered. Most fumbled with phones, desperate to capture what they didn't understand. But the woman in 13F understood. This was farewell. Her lips pressed together in a faint, resolute smile. She lifted her hand once more to the window, palm flat against the glass. She didn't wave. She didn't seek attention. She simply acknowledged. The tribute, sealing the unspoken bond between aviators. Moments later, the Raptors peeled away in perfect symmetry, banking gracefully until they vanished into the horizon. The commercial jet was alone again, descending steadily toward the runway. A strange silence filled the cabin. The spectacle was over, yet its echo lingered. Passengers exchanged bewildered looks, trying to make sense of what they'd seen. The woman sat back, her expression unreadable, but her heart full. As the landing gear lowered with a deep mechanical groan, she closed her eyes briefly. She thought of her call sign spoken one last time, not as a duty, but as a memory carried forward by others. She thought of the comrades who never made it. Back, the ones who would never feel this descent, this return to Earth. When the plane touched down, tires squealing against asphalt, she opened her eyes again. The jolt was grounding, literal and symbolic. She was back, not as the warrior she once was, but as someone remembered, honored, and quietly acknowledged by those who still carried the mission forward. The aircraft slowed, turning smoothly toward the terminal. Passengers exhaled relief, stretching stiff limbs, gathering bags from under seats. Chatter returned, light and buzzing, though always circling back to the two fighters. "Did you see that? Never seen anything like it. Who do you think was on this plane?" The woman remained silent, methodical in her movements, as she reached for her bag. She didn't rush. She never rushed. Discipline lived in her. Muscles. The young man beside her finally whispered, "Who are you? Really?" She glanced at him one last time. A pause stretched between them, heavy and delicate. Then she gave him an answer, not with a title, not with a story, but with something simpler. Just someone who loved to fly. It was the truth. The only truth he needed. The seatbelt sign chimed off. The aisle filled with restless passengers, eager to stand after hours in the air. She remained seated, waiting with patience. Another old habit, never rush to disembark, never scramble for position. When her turn came, she stood with measured grace. The bag slung over her shoulder was light, but her presence felt heavier. Somehow, as though she carried the unseen weight of every salute, every mission, every memory of the sky. The flight attendants offered polite goodbyes as she approached the door. Yet one of them, the army brat, met her eyes and held the look a fraction longer. It wasn't recognition of identity, but of essence. She didn't ask. She didn't speak. She simply nodded. The woman nodded back. And then she stepped into the jet bridge, the cool rush of conditioned air hitting her face. Passengers bustled past, phones in hand, already posting about the crazy fighter escort. For them, it was spectacle. For her, it was homecoming. As she walked toward the terminal, her thoughts drifted to the Raptors again. She wondered who the pilots were. Young, sharp, disciplined. She wondered if they knew her story, or if all they knew was the call sign, whispered down from one generation to the next like folklore. Either way, it didn't matter. They had saluted. They had remembered. And that was enough. The terminal swallowed her in its rhythm of arrivals and departures. Crowds surged, announcements echoed, wheels clattered against tile floors. She blended seamlessly into it all, anonymous once again. But in the skies above Washington, in the hearts of two F-22 pilots, she was not anonymous. She was the Valkyrie. And her call sign, spoken across secure channels just minutes before, would be carried with reverence long after she disappeared into the crowd. For every pilot who saluted her from the cockpit, for every comrade who never came home, for every moment spent in the endless blue, her story lived on. She was only in seat 13F, but in truth, she had never left the sky.